Nvidia's latest 51123 driver released on January 15th and includes a number of improvements like the addition of an Nvidia freestyle filter for screen space ray trace global illumination like we covered on the channel before from Battaglia. It also included Deep Learning Dynamic Super Resolution, or for short, DLDSR. And that is what this video is going to be all about today. According to Nvidia, this new downsampling technique, which leverages deep learning in some capacity, is an improvement over its previous driver downsampling, DSR. So in this video, I will test that claim. Simple enough, but hopefully with great benefit for you, the end user. But before I get into DLDSR itself, I really want to talk about what the original DSR in the Nvidia driver does. The original DSR was released in 2014 and is a form of downsampling. Downsampling is the idea of rendering a game at a higher resolution and outputting it at a lower resolution. The reason why you would want to do this as a user is for a situation like I present here. You have a GPU like the RTX 2060 and a 1080p screen, let's say. The game you're playing is running super fast, like The Witcher 3 here at 1080p. And instead of wanting ultra high performance, maybe you want to improve image quality above that which the game offers in its menu. Here's where you can use DSR. So let us take a greater look here at The Witcher 3 to show off how DSR works. Here for this demonstration, I've turned off all in-game anti-aliasing to show what downsampling does in an isolated way. So we have native 1080p on the left with no anti-aliasing at all, then 4x DSR on the right with 0% smoothness as set in the driver. On the right here, the internal image is actually 4K, but it is being displayed to the output screen's 1080p via the downsampling method in the driver. Notice how the detail is so much more stable and less flickery in the DSR image, like in Geralt's hair. Notice how details are fuller and more precise across the entire image, whether that be textures or edges. Notice how depth of field looks even much more stable and flickers less in comparison. As mentioned, I purposely left off anti-aliasing in both images. So if we look at a straight edge, we can see how the downsampling in DSR adds anti-aliasing to the output image. You can see that via the gradient produced on the edge here. There's a gradient on the right and none on the left. Downsampling, or DSR, is in fact ordered grid supersample anti-aliasing. This is one of the oldest and most rigorous types of simple anti-aliasing. This is what DSR is all about. This has a performance cost though, as on an RTX 2060 running this screen, the 4x DSR image runs 60% slower and is below 60 FPS. So downsampling is not a free lunch for the GPU, but it's something you can do when you have excess GPU power on the table. So what if you don't want to drop performance so much? Well, you can get the benefits of downsampling, but have it not be as expensive as DSR 4X. For example, you can downsample from a resolution that is not as high. Here's where the Nvidia driver, for example, offers a 2.25x mode, running at 2.25x the internal resolution before the downsample. So let us try that out at the same 0% smoothness. Next to the results we saw earlier at the same settings, we see something very curious. This 2.25x downsample doesn't really look dramatically better like we saw with the 4x result. In fact, it doesn't look that great at all. If we stop a frame and look at an edge, we can see that actually there is a difference here in the amount of edges presented due to the amount of extra bumps here. This implies a higher resolution, but it doesn't look that great. And if we look behind Geralt in the depth of field, we can see an issue that is happening here. Notice how pixelated and odd it looks in comparison to native, as well as 4x DSR. The reason for this is because the 2.25x downsample, or 1620p internally, does not gracefully fit into 1080p. It's 2.25x the resolution, and it is an uneven division. See, for a 4x downsample, like 4K to 1080p, as found in DSR 4X, for each pixel in the 1080p image, there is an even amount of subpixels in a grid, making up 4 times the higher resolution. It downsamples very nicely and cleanly. This is not possible with an uneven scale like 2.25x. So when we look at DSR 2.25x here, we can see this unevenness issue all throughout all these images. Like Geralt here in the doorway. If I ping pong the footage of him there, you can see how unstable and weird and popping the 2.25x footage looks in comparison. even though it's higher res than the 1080p image. To solve this issue of an uneven scale, there are different types of filters that are used to achieve downsampling. These filters essentially try and massage uneven integer scales to look a lot better. Some of these filter names that I've listed here you might have heard of before, but for the Nvidia driver DSR in 2014, it used a Gaussian filter where you have control over its relative strength or smoothness. My previous tests were at 0% smoothness, as I mentioned. So let us try to alleviate this issue by testing the default smoothness value of 33%. In comparison, we can see how that smoothing filter gets rid of a lot of the previous issues. Shapes and forms no longer look odd and wobbly if we look at Geralt in the doorway here. Depth of field no longer has the odd pattern or structure visible in it anymore. We look at edges, we can see a gradient there, like we want to actually see. We're getting anti-aliasing here, and competent downsampling. If I present it next to the 4x image without smoothing though, we can see how that this 2.25x scaling with smoothing is better than native 1080p, I would say, but it's not as perfect as the 4x result. There's still a lot more aliasing and flicker than the 4x result if we look at anything like Geralt's hair, for example. Another issue is that this smoothing filter has repercussions. It can smooth out detail at times as a side effect. Check out Geralt's face here. Notice how much more unfocused it looks in its detail in comparison to the 4x downsample, and in a roundabout way in comparison to the native 1080p image. So that's how DSR worked before. The new DLDSR is supposed to improve upon this, and based upon my testing so far, I believe DLDSR is mainly changing this single step in the downsampling change. The internal resolution rendered is being done the exact same way as the previous DSR, but instead of a Gaussian filter to massage that uneven scale, some form of inferencing or ML stuff is happening on a per pixel basis to massage those ordered grid samples down into the lower resolution image, perhaps doing each pixel in a different fashion depending upon context clues. And based upon the results, it does look actually rather different. For example, take a look at this scenario of 0% smoothing for both 2.25x DSR and 2.25x DLDSR. Both have no anti-aliasing on in-game. For the normal DSR, we know this looks very broken due to the uneven scale and the lack of filter massaging the results. It looks bad. For DLDSR, that is not the case at all, even at 0% smoothing. Just take a look at this shot of Geralt in the tub. First look at the edge of the tub and the aliasing there. The DLDSR result is actually smoothing the edge with an anti-alias look with gradients and everything. If we look at the background depth of field, it is not broken, even though 0% smoothing is happening. Based on such a result, yes, DLDSR is by far better than the original DSR at like-for-like settings. And based upon the edge gradients I'm seeing here in this shot, the ML filter step, whatever it is doing, seems also like some sort of edge detection and edge anti-aliasing is happening there, which is unexpected. So what are the catches? Firstly, the new downsampling filter costs more. It's roughly 3% slower here on the RTX 2060 in like-for-like scenarios. Secondly, its 0% smoothing does actually create artifacts. Check out this shot here of Yennefer's face between the recordings, left at 1080p native, old DSR in the middle, new DSR on the right. Notice something wrong? The internal surfaces and textures with DLDSR at 0% smoothing have an intense sharpening pattern within them. Yennefer's skin here looks like paper and greatly aged as a result. So 0% smoothing is not actually very viable unless you like a very internally sharpened looking image. To fix this issue, you can use the smoothing slider that DLDSR also has, but it doesn't have such a negative blurring result like we saw earlier with the original DSR. Here's what that smoothing looks like altogether. Slightly sharper at 33%, but more akin to the original 4x DSR at 50%. So I think you really want to use the smoothing filter here for DLDSR. Now let's see how DLDSR stacks up in total with smoothing against the original version. At 33% smoothing here, the new DLDSR does in fact have many improvements over the previous version. Let us look at an edge in a still. Notice the bowl here on the table. Notice how the lines of the bowl's edge are actually smoother and complete in the new DLDSR here. This is not expected, as both downsamples are actually working from that same rigid, ordered grid internal resolution. So whatever DLDSR is doing to filter that result and anti-alias them, well, it also can complete lines in an unexpected way. This is also visible in other surface types, like Geralt's hair. Here we can see that same deal, where strands are actually more complete with the new DSR scheme, and they have less holes and pixel edges within the hair structure. But one thing that really shocked me is what happens with anti-aliasing in motion, which is also reduced. Take a look here at Geralt's necklace. With the normal DSR, we can see how it is very aliased. Moving the image back and forth, we can see how little white pixels in it change with every frame, causing flickering and aliasing. This is not desired image quality by standard metrics. Let us compare to DLDSR. Notice how in the exact same shot and movement, same settings for smoothness, and the same no AA internally on in the game, well, in spite of all those things, the necklace now has much reduced aliasing in movement. Less flicker, less pop, none of those rogue pixels. This is much cleaner and less distracting. So this new DLDSR downsample filter is also, in certain moments, exhibiting a kind of temporal anti-aliasing effect. This is pretty neat, and I find it rather unexpected. So yes, I think it is easy to see how much better the image quality is in this new DLDSR as long as you're using smoothing. I think Nvidia's claims here are rather sound. But what about this claim implied from their image in their blog? How does DLDSR at 2.25x compare to the old DSR at 4x? Does it actually look rather similar for much better performance? Let's find out. Getting straight into it, there are indeed some areas where the new DLDSR at 2.25x interestingly has improvements over the previous DSR at 4x. Let's look at that bowl on the table that I talked about earlier. DLDSR at 2.25x does indeed offer a more complete edge on that bowl. Its anti-aliasing is better in spite of it being at a much lower internal resolution and running much faster. If we look at Geralt's necklace in the scene that I mentioned earlier, yep, we actually see less flicker and aliasing on that necklace as it moves in the cutscene. If you stop the camera and take a look at a gradient on an edge, you can actually see better edge gradients in that still than the previous DSR at 4x. And if you pay attention there too, you can also see that sharpening behavior and action in DLDSR on the wood grain texture here that you can control the strength of with the smoothness slider. So DLDSR at 2.25x can indeed be competitive or in some ways better than the previous DSR at 4x, but I still think it has its limits that the filtering cannot overcome. Subpixel aliasing, for example, in Geralt's hair. DLDSR does a good job here, but those smaller than a pixel-sized hairs are really helped out by the higher resolution in DSR 4x, and I think it's plain to see. Similarly, there are aliasing in movement in other areas, like in depth of field. The higher resolution there of the old DSR 4x helps out such things. This type of behavior can be found across the recording I made in very different areas. DLDSR 2.25x is definitely better than its predecessor at the same resolution, and it can have aspects that are comparable or even better than the 4x of old, but it doesn't always beat it in a decisive way. So Nvidia's claim here about it being literally comparable, yeah, that definitely holds up, but I wouldn't say it is exchangeable or that DLDSR supersedes the old when the old is higher res. It comes close, but it does lose out in important areas like the ones I highlighted. So there you have it. But before I round out this video in the end, I wanted to show off one last tip and trick here with the new DLDSR in God of War, which I've been having here running in the background as B-roll with DLDSR on in that B-roll. So this little trick is actually rather simple. In those games with DLSS, you can use DLDSR in combination with DLSS to get large bumps in image quality, but while minimizing that performance impact of downsampling. This can be done by having DLDSR on, like you can see here where in God of War, it's 1620p output resolution on a 1080p screen, but then also set DLSS to quality or perhaps even balanced mode. In quality mode, for example, like you see here, you can see that same internal resolution as the real output resolution. So 1080p internal and 1080p output, but then DLDSR is kind of upsampling and downsampling here. As you can see, you get a performance boost by doing this. DLSS in quality mode, as shown on the far right, is no longer spatially supersampling while downsampling, as the samples are coming from this DLSS network over time. This is cheaper than rendering real pixels for downsampling like you see in the middle here. But still, DLSS, in quality mode at least, is more expensive than just plain native rendering, as there's a downsampling filter cost, a DLSS runtime cost, and any other buffers like higher res UI. If you were to go down to something like balance mode, as you can see in this comparison here, well, that would be closer to native resolution, non-downsampling performance. The reason I recommend doing this, as it's a bit like cheating, as you're getting downsampling quality in general, but at a lower cost. Check out Kratos' beard here, for example. Notice how much less flickery it is in motion in the DLSS view in quality mode and in the plain DLDSR view in comparison to the 1080p native recording. Now, if you just look at that DLSS view, it is extremely similar to the DLDSR view, but it is running actually decidedly better. This applies to any of the elements in the scene where DLSS does a great job. For example, look at this distance foliage here. Scarcely a difference there, but much cheaper in performance. For this little hack, I'm showing off DLSS quality mode, but you could try out other modes if you would wish to, like balanced, to see how they fare based upon your image quality and performance preferences. And with that little hack described, I think I've come to the end of this video. My conclusion is that DLDSR is an interesting advancement, and I do like what I'm seeing, and it is surprisingly comparable to the old DSR 4X, but of course with better performance because it's running at a lower res. But not perfect, of course. There's one thing I would like to see Nvidia do is offer more than just 2 modes for this, but all the same modes that we saw in the original DSR. But that's it. If you did like this video, hit that like button and subscribe to the channel. If you are already a subscriber, hit that little bell in the corner to be informed as soon as Digital Foundry posts a video. If you want to help us out, support DF on Patreon to get years worth of our content in high quality for download. And if you want to talk to me about DLDSR, write a comment below or follow me and Digital Foundry on Twitter. As always, this is Alex bidding you farewell und auf Wiedersehen.